first of all, I just do want to thank you very much, Eric, for stepping in at such short notice.
I was actually planning on coming anyway.
Well, but
because it's such a nice event.
Coming and speaking in public are two slightly different things, so thank you very much. I want to ask you about, we have a load of questions for you from the floor as well, but I want to ask you about how technology will change our lives in various different ways in 2013. So let's, what I thought we might do is start small and then pan out and go bigger. So in the publication, The World in 2013, we make mention a number of actually Google initiatives that are sort of fascinating in the way that they might change lives. One is Google Glass. So the idea of wearable computing. Is that really going to be something that is going to be seen more and more next year and beyond that?
The technology works, and if you haven't looked at Google Glass, it's a little sort of glasses that sit right above your normal focal plane. They don't put it right in your eye, they put it right above, and it can show a video. It also has a camera, it can give you updates, and it has a single toggle. We've been experimenting with what this could be used for, but there are obvious uses for your daily lives. We've never had a device that recorded or could record what you saw contemporaneously. Think about it.
So how will we use it?
We don't know.
We're going to start crashing into all sorts of things because we're looking at our glasses.
Well, hopefully there'll be telemetry that will tell you you're about to trip. But I think the simple answer is that you can, whenever the digital world can see what the analog world is doing, we get interesting possibilities. Whether it's the obvious things like people who are working on fixing eyeglasses and medical applications, to more interesting ones involving performers who then show the audience what they see in addition to what the audience sees of the performer. There are many, many creative such acts of it.
Okay,
we debuted this at the New York Fashion Show, where some of the models were actually wearing this. You could see what they saw as you looked at them wearing the newest fashions.
So that was one of the things that, one of the eye-catching, literally, trends. Another was the whole idea of driverless cars, which is...
There is a driver. The driver is just doing something else.
Okay.
So I've been in this thing. It's a Lexus RX 450, and there's a button, and then you just take your hands off the wheel and the steering wheel, and it just goes along. And it takes, on average, about 20 minutes for the person to stop freaking out. We've been studying this extensively because there's cameras in the car. But for the first 20 minutes, their faces are ashen, and they're watching the car drive. So my experience, my first 20 minutes, is I am a more cautious driver than our cars are. And so I saw, of course, the traffic slowing down and a potential accident up front. And I would have, I saw it ahead, but nevertheless, the car did it exactly right. And when the car in front of you lurches like this, you too, and you can see that the AI system is deciding whether it has an escape lane or whether it's going to have to slam on the brakes. And it can do it faster than you can.
So at the moment, just to be clear, these are experimental vehicles. You're not about to see one trying to, well, you move so slowly in New York anyway that it wouldn't make much difference. It's not
going to make much difference in New York, but I'll tell you that the great thing is it's in California, you're at 65 miles an hour, you click it up, and you're a sports car. But we do a race. We have a private race course. So we race Priuses against each other, and we have a driverless Prius against a human-driven Prius, and the driverless Prius wins every time.
But just to get a sense of, these are, increasing numbers of these are actually being...
And over the next few years, you'll see a lot of them.
I think Sergey Brin said 5 years' time they'll be...
We don't really know, but that's a reasonable estimate. It's important to understand that for these things to really be production, they have to have two fail modes. So you really don't want to have mechanical systems that have single points of failure. The human in a normal car is a single point of failure, and we don't want to replicate that. We want to have dual sets of brake controls, dual ways of controlling the steering, and those kinds of things, and those are in development. We're obviously having fun with this as a subject. If you know someone who has lost someone in a traffic accident in America, you understand why we're doing this. 30,000 people. We don't even cover it in the news anymore. It's so common. And by the way, that's a record low death rate given miles driven. We're doing better in 30,000, which is 10 times more than the number of people killed in 9/11 every year. This is terrible. So if we can make a significant dent on that, we should do it.
I was talking earlier about the internet going increasingly mobile, that this coming year is the year when there will be more, at least by some measures, internet-connected devices that are mobile rather than fixed. So this is all part of that trend in a way. This is things and devices that are on the move that are connected up. Do you see that as being something that changes fundamentally the way we use that technology?
I think all of us, looking at the age of the audience, many of us sort of lived in a model where there was basically network platforms, standard PCs or so forth, that were pretty much controlled by a single either architecture or vendor in the case of the PC model. What we're seeing now is an explosion in different kinds of devices, and whether it's mobility and so forth and so on, and we don't exactly know how it will play out. What we do know is that the mobile devices are quickly surpassing any fixed use. Any of the Macs and PCs are being left in the dust. The numbers, give you an example with Android, which is now the #1 platform in mobile computing. It's about 5 times larger in its current sales than the iPhone. Always an interesting fact for people. More than 500 million installed base. It'll be 1 billion sometime next year. We're turning on 1.3 million of these phones or devices every day globally. So the scale of this in terms of reach and impact, and we talk about it here, and here in New York, you're lucky if the phone system works, and so it's kind of like it's an improvement in your life. And New Yorkers are pretty sophisticated anyway. Imagine when this device shows up in your developing country village, right, with access to all the world's information in such a great form factor. It's really life-changing.
I want to ask you about video, because we have a question here from somewhere, anonymously. What makes a video go viral? And I was wondering whether that was partly Gangnam Style.
Yes, Psy is the record. His name is Psy Park. If you haven't heard this, your children have. It's the greatest dance style ever. And last week he surpassed Justin Bieber as the most popular sort of phenomena on the net. The video answer is even more interesting.
But you have been caught Gangnam styling, have you?
Let's just say he's a much better dancer than I will ever be.
Did you go viral?
Yes, unfortunately. The scope and scale of video online is much larger than people appreciate. What is the content of the internet? Turns out it's video. What's the #1 source of video online? Netflix. Interesting. Now, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, is there any scenario where people will use the internet to watch the equivalent of movies? I'd say, you've got to be kidding. It's a terrible use of the internet. And I can give you a long list of reasons why I'm right. But the society has proven that I'm wrong. And indeed, it's Netflix is 1 and YouTube is #2. And between the two, they occupy almost half of the total bandwidth of the internet. Think about it. Yeah. So in terms of virality, the way you become viral is you do something that's sort of quirky and fun.
Talking about new things, new ways that you're experimenting, I think I'm right in saying that you also have energy projects. Again, we have an article in the World in 2013 about the extraordinary reduction in cost of solar power, for example. Something similar to Moore's law applying to solar panels.
Yeah, it's not actually fully Moore's law. There's also sort of the China law, which is China sort of overproduces to the point of bankruptcy, which is sort of why the panels are so low. But it's close.
But do you see technology as transforming our energy situation?
It is, and I think although it's controversial, the fact of the matter is we should give credit to the people who invented these new forms of oil and natural gas drilling, generally known as fracking, hydraulic fracking, and so forth. Those are American technological successes that have enabled us to sort of find more of this stuff. And again, we can decide, we have a separate discussion as to how to regulate them and so forth, which is sort of very controversial. But the fact of the matter is that has materially changed the economic structure of energy in America. If you take a look at conservation and renewables, which I think is ultimately the right answer, what you see now is the automation and instrumentation of passive systems changes everything. So this goes under the term of smart building. most of the, roughly 40% of the carbon emissions that are coming out of the US are coming out of buildings. Interesting. And frankly, if you would stop heating all the buildings in New York as high as you do, and you'd insulate them a lot better, you'd make a significant contribution. So if you do that at scale, so you think about passive insulation as your first thing, then you think about the adoption of renewables, solar being the one. The interesting thing about solar is it's not even as good as wind. Wind is within 1 cent of a kilowatt equal to coal in the current structures, and that's phenomenal. And so let it come down its curve. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic that automation, energy use, instrumentation of your use, so forth. Anybody here played with something called a Nest thermostat? It's a thermostat that you sort of screw into your wall, and it's allegedly possible for you to do this on your own. I think it's going to be one of the great sort of Christmas presents from people who are sensitive about these things. And it learns what you want in temperature, and it does it dynamically, and it Wi-Fi's out what it's up to.
So what is Google's activity in the energy area?
We have ultimately decided to fund a lot of this stuff rather than build it ourselves because we thought we were better off as a banker to it. But I'll tell you that the level of innovation in energy is equal to the level of energy in the tech world that we normally celebrate here.
So how does all this relate to search and your core business? How does it? What is the rationale for this variety of projects that you get involved in?
Google wants to be at the center of the information revolution, and we want to be in a decade and in 20 years and 30 years. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to be part of what will happen, and we're not always perfect, and we do make mistakes. One of the more interesting things we've done is in Kansas City, where we have wired up a small number of houses now, and we're now beginning to seriously implement it across the city, 1 gigabit of Ethernet. And you say, well, do I really need 1 gigabit? Well, if I gave you, and by the way, the measured performance is 780 down and 720 up megabits, think about how your world could change. At that point, there's no difference between your computer and the computer center that it talks to. They're literally in one room together. It allows all of the different media that we so carefully have husbanded into, this group and this group and this group, they all go away because you can handle as many HD DVDs as you want, all of the media that you care about, all dynamically and all real time on this format. So if the technology works, and so far the results are fantastic, right? And if the business works, and so far it looks like it's going to be a very profitable business, it may be possible for us and others to wire the new world at 1 gigabit. And that's the next step change and roughly today, give you an example, your average performance is on the order of 100 times less than that.
But I want to come back to the search. I mean, when you look at these initiatives, do you try also to bring them back to how they can make money for Google?
We don't. We have the luxury of not worrying about that as much because we try not to worry about these things, right? So it's a luxury. We have the luxury of time because our core revenue engine is so strong. Our success in search continues, and the way to think about search is to think that search is imperfect because it gives you a lot of choices. We would like to be able to give you the one answer that's correct. And so and again, you have to opt in, and this is all voluntary and all that kind of stuff, the more information that you tell us about yourself, the more accurate the result can be. The next generation of search will be much more targeted at you, and in fact, we may be able to get to the point where we suggest what you should be searching for. Classic example, right? Well, we're in the search business, we'll suggest what you're looking for. So I guess that'll be our motto. So here you are in a strange city, and we know that you are a history buff. So as you walk along the streets of New York, we tell you the history of the street. It's easy enough. It's very easy for us to figure that out. It's very easy for us to generate those searches. You can imagine that the union of the mobile platform, the cloud computing platform, and the information platform gives us unprecedented vision into what you both are thinking about and you might want to think about as suggestions, and again, if you should opt into that.
But it's interesting that the example you take is walking about a city. So that's an example of where you are mobile. It's no longer someone sitting at a computer saying, I want to know X.
No, but the future is mobile. We call it mobile first. Here in New York, you have this explosion of high-tech startups. Every single one of them starts with a mobile app for basically an iPhone and an Android phone. So literally, that's their first design. how is the user going to interact with my service? How are they going to experience it?
So one prediction that one can make with some confidence in the year ahead is that you will publish a book because you've announced.
That's right.
It's been announced.
The contract has been signed.
You and Google Ideas Director Jared Cohen are publishing a book called The New Digital Age. So can you give us an idea, a little preview of what the book is going to cover, and presumably some of the things you've been talking about?
Yes, we sat down over the last 18 months, traveled around the world, talked to people about where they thought technology was going, but more importantly, how society would adapt to it. And we came to the end of the book with a very optimistic view of this. A simple way of thinking about it is, let's go back to The Economist. I've read The Economist for years. What does The Economist cover? It covers dictators, economic problems, corruption, technological innovation, healthcare issues, and general sort of things. Everybody.
And Google occasionally.
Yes, occasionally.
Like last week.
Yeah, last week we were on the cover, and covered us as well. So let's go through each of those. So how do you solve the bad dictator problem? You empower the citizens. And unless the dictator is willing to shut down the internet and shoot everybody, which they're getting desperate enough to do, it puts a real check and balance. Even China, which is certainly not an elected country, is sensitive to public criticism. If you look at the train accident, Weibo, which is their version of Twitter, disciplined the party chief who ultimately was in charge of building out the railways. And ultimately, this fellow, who was seen as a god, is now on his way to prison because of corruption. Think about the terrible things that go on in the world to people who are at the whim of the police chief or minorities, or the terrible status that women are treated in much of the developing world. People have cameras. You can now anonymously report things. You could imagine a network where a bad thing is occurring, you can report it, you report it anonymously, you can have anonymous responders. We can build those kinds of networks, and they're in development now. The fact that everybody's connected has large numbers of step functions of improvements there. Let's think about healthcare. We were talking earlier in the video about 2050 about healthcare, and people sort of snickered when the gentleman mentioned to it. The FDA just approved the first pill that you can swallow that has a digital chip in it that Wi-Fi's out what's going on in your stomach. So all of us basically would like to know what's going on with our nutrition. Here's a simple solution. Will you take this pill? Yeah, you will. You will because it's your health. And ultimately, it'll be in your best interest. We did a series of seminars on essentially transdermal patches, which are sort of skin-thin sort of surfaces that you put on your skin, and they have, among other thing, they use the energy of your body to power a Wi-Fi connection, which then monitors what's going on inside your body, right? So all of a sudden, it Wi-Fi's out to your phone. Your phone says, you're in big trouble, calls the doctor calls you back. What a shock, right? Calls you and says, get to the hospital right now. There's so many examples where the digitization and instrumentation of the world using the combination of the mobile devices, and I bet you everybody in this room has a mobile device on them right now, and if I went up and grabbed it from you, you'd think I was stealing the most important thing you ever had, which I'm not going to do, so don't worry. Over and over again, what we've seen is when you empower people with information, they act, and they act in ways that really make a lot of sense.
So if we take one of those areas that you mentioned, democracy, and right. The example you gave was in some of the less democratic parts of the world where democracy is in short supply, and where technology can provide a check and a balance and a prod for accountability. What about the mature democracies? I mean, you just had an election in this country. Did that teach any lessons? Were there any technology lessons to be drawn from this year's election?
It's always hard to reason from one event. The winners get to write history, and the losers sort of think about the next election. There's no question the Obama campaign, because I was part of it, had a technology strategy that helped elect the president, and it was based on cloud computing, scalable processors and targeted programs, and get out the vote. To me, the way to say this is that governments are going to change too, because on the one hand, governments spend an awful lot of time delivering services, and now we can measure them. So if somebody asks you, give me some money to donate rice to the following village, we can now check by SMSing whether the rice actually got there. Another check and balance on sort of the corruption nature of things. And we can test the effectiveness of programs. To give you some of the more sort of worrisome examples, governments can actually know where people really are, and governments can actually figure out what people report they're doing versus what they're really doing. There are all sorts of Kafkaesque and worrisome scenarios that you could imagine, the slippery slopes. I'll pick one in Britain. In London, when you're walking the streets of London, you're on a camera, and those cameras are protected by law. So in the last 5 years, technology has emerged that allows face detection to be very accurate. And a simple rule is if we have a front picture of you, and there are 13 pictures of you on the internet, within a 95% confidence interval, we can identify you. Anybody here have 13 pictures on the internet? Every one of you. You know why? Because of Facebook. Because you put them there, or something similar. So the fact of the matter is that you can begin to link these systems, and the linking has a lot of implications for how this will play out.
Now, as we mentioned, Google and others were on the cover of The Economist this last week. It was really a story of the battle of the modern titans. You mentioned several of them already. So yourselves, Facebook, Apple, Amazon. How do you see that battle playing out in the year ahead? First of all, do you see it as a battle?
Yeah, in the past I've called this the Gang of Four. I'm not sure that's such a good analysis, but I think it's roughly correct. In our industry, we've never had 4 network scalable platforms competing at this scale. We've always had one. It was IBM and its monopoly, which spent 13 years in the Antitrust division. We had IBM and the PC architectures, and Intel. Microsoft, of course, went through the whole trial, 1997 through 2000. Now we have at least 4. And they're each run by hopefully sharp people who understand what they're doing, and they're all both competing but also cooperating. And the reason this is relevant to you all is it's driving prices down at a rate that is phenomenal. So when you look at an iPhone 5 and the Android competitors, and you realize what amount of computation you have, and you got it for a subsidized price of $100 or $200, and people say, well, that's not, whatever. It is extraordinary. And that competition, which is brutal, by the way, I think is ultimately beneficial. Take a look at Amazon. Amazon, very controversial, roughly 50% of all of the sort of online world, and a larger and larger part of the general e-commerce. Again, extraordinarily well run, extraordinarily deep in terms of its understanding of how to suggest things for you and so forth, and incredibly convenient. Take a look at Facebook. If you have 1 billion users who use you roughly every 3 minutes, you can make money from them. This is not that complicated. You just have to figure out a way. So each of these platforms, right, and again, these are typically free platforms, are going to drive it. Each of them operates under a different set of religious rules. And so the analogy I would offer, so let's look at Apple and Google, for example. Think of these as 2 countries, right? So in the old high-tech way, one would dominate the other one would disappear fairly quickly. But it's much more likely that each country, which has its own religion and its own incompatible view of the other, is going to have to put up with the other and find ways to work together. In Apple and Google's case, for example, we compete very, very hardly on the mobile world, but we also are search partners.
And new countries appear, and old countries that were there but aren't members of the Gang of Four.
No, and I'm certainly not suggesting that this is the only group. There are many potential fifth candidates. Twitter has been one that has been suggested, even Netflix, which I mentioned. And of course, Microsoft is absent in my calculation, although they certainly wish that they were.
We have some very good questions from the floor that relate to some of this. So one question is, how will the scrutiny over the use of user data by companies such as Google and Facebook affect their business strategies in 2013?
So what happens with all of these companies collect a lot of data, and each of them has different rules. There are sort of, in the first place, their behavior is largely going to be controlled by the European privacy laws. And there's something called the European Data Protectorate, which is all about what you do with the sort of big data analytics. And I think ultimately a sane solution is going to say that that the data is owned by the person, not by the company, or at least cannot be used without that person's permission, and a lot of the regulators are pushing that way, and that anonymized data has to be really anonymized for it to be used. I'll tell you that when we think about privacy, we think about it as privacy and security. Security is our job. Our systems have to be secure. If you entrust your data with us, it's got to not be made available to anybody else unless it's by court of law. But privacy is something that is sort of up to us and you. You have to decide how much of this information you want to be sharing with other people, and we need to make sure that it remains private.
Another good question from the floor is, do the current heads of AOL, Yahoo, and Facebook leave Google because they saw no rewards internally?
Well, in each case, they became, let's see, CEOs of important and powerful companies, and that position has been occupied by Larry and myself. So I think perhaps they wanted a career path that wasn't in front of them. Each of them is fantastic, and if you look, each of them sort of trained at Google, independently strong, they'll make a good showing. They certainly will.
I wanted to ask you about antitrust. I know you have some limitations on what you can say on that, but that is clearly going to be one of the big challenges in the year ahead for, for all these companies potentially, but for Google in particular.
Yeah, so why don't you ask your question?
How are you preparing, planning, responding to that challenge?
There's a couple of comments about antitrust. The laws differ in Europe and in the US. The European process is a finding at the sort of EU level, and we have been under investigation for almost 2 years by the commissioner there and his staff. And during this period, they seek comment from everybody, and we give them literally millions of documents. We have not, and we're busy negotiating with them. We don't think we violated any European laws, but we're happy to have the conversation, and we're sort of now waiting on what they decide to do. We have been negotiating back and forth, and they've announced that publicly. In the United States, the law is similar but different in the way it's applied. In our case, the government decided to have the Federal Trade Commission look at this, and a similar investigation is underway. There were a series of hearings. I testified at the hearings, and again, I don't see the consumer harm under Section 2, and we've asked the government to come back and give us the examples of things which are violations of law. We haven't seen that yet. We are also in negotiations with them, and that's probably all I should say. So what I would say is we talk to these people a lot. We're sort of waiting on them at some level, and we're in sort of, hopefully, the ideal scenario would be that we come to a mutual agreement with both of these groups.
It just strikes me thinking about that, and you mentioned so many of these other initiatives that you're involved in. How do you decide where to focus, what to focus on when you look at, say, planning for 2013? Because you have such a huge range of things that you're...
But you use the wrong word. You don't plan. You sort of build a system. You build a product. You build a system that innovates in 2013, because innovation comes from everywhere. So if you'd asked us 5 years ago, would we be in the driverless cars business, we would say, well, it's an interesting research idea, And so it's taken this long to build the lasers and the other algorithms and so forth, and computer science has moved forward. So I think our decisions are largely based by how much sort of progress we're making in each of these initiatives. But we're lucky that people are constantly suggesting new ideas and new uses of this technology, which I think is one of the great things about Google, and one of the great things about high tech. It's fun to work in companies where people are constantly suggesting completely new approaches to the problem.
So here's a very nice question from the floor, which sort of combines some of the smaller individual things that you are involved in with a bigger picture that you've been talking about. It talks about translation as a very fast-growing industry globally. Given that translation is key to spreading democracy and capitalism, what role will machine translation play in giving the middle class solving middle class problems? Middle East problems, sorry.
So when we started this, we had a scientist who invented a new technique, which is called statistical machine translation. And here's how it works. If you take English and Chinese, English and Russian, English and Arabic, and you sort of put the paragraphs next to each other, and one goes one way, one goes the other, that kind of stuff, and you apply these algorithms, it can begin to learn to translate any text into any other text. And I'm not making this up. This is literally magic. Mathematically, what it's doing is it's looking for patterns. It recognizes a pattern, the pattern repeats, and that's how the translation is done. This translation, by the way, does not use a dictionary. That's why it's so interesting. In some sense, it's brute force, right? It doesn't have any understanding of what it's translating at all. But the beauty of the statistical machine translation, which is what we use, is that you can go from any language to any language. So in a very small amount of time, we will end up with a situation where we have 100 languages into 100 languages for all the content in the world. Now the question obviously was, how does this affect things in the Middle East? It affects everything, because a lot of conflict in the world, and especially wars, have been created because of a lack of understanding. One of the comments was that there's a large body of Arabic language work that's never been translated into anything, and almost none of that is online. So all of a sudden, if we can put all of that stuff online, sort of the notion of having a little bit of respect for each other is going to go a long way.
So there's another question coming up related to this. I'm from Africa. What is Google's support contribution to enabling access to the internet via Wi-Fi?
What we did is the African situation, as usual, is worse than anywhere else. And as a society, as a global society, we've got to sort of look at ourselves and think, how have we allowed these terrible, terrible things to occur over so many decades? So what's the story of the internet in Africa? The internet is the most expensive in any part of the world in Africa, which is the poorest part of the world. How can this be? Well, in many cases, it's because of distance. In many cases, it's because of satellites. In many cases, it's because of monopoly providers. There's no really good excuse for this. So what we've done is we've built what are called proxy caches, which we put in each of the countries, which speed up the internet. We've also been funding competitive carriers, and in particular competitive fiber, to that. So the questioner asks, what do we do about internet with Wi-Fi? So the problem is you've got your phone, and the 3G connection, the connection that enables your phone to work, is impossibly expensive. Well, it turns out that more than half of the mobile traffic is not on the cellular providers, what you know as 3G and 4G. It's on what you know as Wi-Fi, which is 802.11 in the sort of routers that people use. And so it's possible to imagine free Wi-Fi sets for villages which share a common connection where people can use their phones. And you can use something called voice over IP, which allows you to speak on the phone over the Wi-Fi network and never have to deal with the cellular provider, and that competition will open up those markets, we think.
Okay, we've just about come to the end of our time, but I want to ask you one last question, which was inevitably came to mind when you were talking about these magical translation devices. Do you think there'll be a magical journalism device that will make all of us at The Economist redundant, and you will produce the Google version of The Economist make...
What's interesting about technology is that we do a pretty good job of catching up to the basics, and we don't do a very good job of genius, right? So if you take a look at Google News, many of you use Google News. It does a pretty good job of assembling the obvious stuff, but it doesn't have a lot of insight. So the role of journalists, in my view, is going to be the role of insight, and it's going to be a long time. So here's an example. We had a project inside of Google to write things, and I suggested, by the way, that you could have it write a paper, and then you could have it recursively add 7%, and then you could add another 7%. So it would sort of produce infinitely long papers. And what it did is it sort of looked mechanically at all this information and assembled it based on these things. And it did a pretty good job of a bad author. But if you read it and you have a good author, you can see the difference. That's, I think, where we are. It may be that 50 years from now, the systems will be so powerful that they can replicate the kind of special insight that journalists and reporters and people who are practitioners have. But it'll be a long time before that's the case.
Well, on that reassuring note, please do. Thank Eric Schmidt. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.